Hi, my name is Jeff Clark, and I'm the APU Technical Support Manager for CDAviation Services located in Joplin, Missouri. As part 2 of our video for the combustor inspection for the GT-CP36-100 Series APU, I will now discuss the inspection of the fuel atomizer, the igniter plug, and the fuel drain valve fitting. Once these items are inspected, the APU is then complete for the combustor inspection for that APU. First, I will start off with the fuel atomizer. Each component removed from the combustion assembly has its own section in the maintenance manual, section 49-2004, to show you where to go to inspect each item: the fuel atomizer, the igniter plug, and the drain fitting. First, we will start with the fuel atomizer. The fuel atomizer's inspection can be found in section 49-30-51 of the maintenance manual. Typically, the general rule is we replace the atomizer 100%. It is a very complicated duplex system. It needs an air blast, primary, secondary fuel source, and if any obstruction is found in any of those items or obstruction is not found, can be very detrimental to the health of the hot section. Therefore, in most situations, we will replace this with a 100% overhaul or new fuel atomizer. However, inspection for this is found in the manual, and if the inspection is acceptable, it can be returned to service. That'll be to your discretion. They want you to look at the inspection of this in the as-is condition because you're looking for carbon deposits or anything abnormal. Therefore, you don't clean this at this point. Inspect it right now in the dirty condition. You're looking for looseness of the shroud, carbon buildup, or any kind of obstructions in any of the fitting orifices. You're also looking at the threads and the B-nut fitting at the flare for any kind of damage. You'll also be looking at the mating surface of the fuel atomizer for any distortion or heavy raised nicks that may prevent it from seating properly. After inspection, and it seems acceptable visually, you can then clean this with a brass brush. You will apply 30 pounds of air pressure to the inlet to allow air to blow. However, you want to turn the atomizer face down to allow gravity to remove any dirt as air is blowing through this. Because as air is going through this, it creates a Venturi effect which can suck the dirt that you're brushing off back down through into the air blast system or the primary or secondary fuel. To clean the fuel atomizer, we will hook up a number 4 fitting to the fuel inlet with air pressure regulated. We will turn this up to 30 pounds of pressure. You will hold the fuel atomizer in a downward position. You're allowing air to flow through it during the cleaning process. So while the gravity is pushing debris down instead of inside, you will take a soft brass bristle brush and you will just clean the head of the atomizer, verifying you're getting it clean. Once you are finished, turn your pressure down, off. Now disconnect your air supply. And that's finished the cleaning. We're now going to discuss the igniter plug inspection. You will find the inspection for the igniter plug, whether it's the low voltage igniter or the high voltage ignition that I showed you earlier and that you may have in the 100E or the 100G APU. Section 49-40-33 will tell you that cleaning of the igniter tip is not permitted. They particularly do not want you to use solvents. Solvents can break away the insulation between the ground and the igniter tip. However, you can clean this lightly with a brass brush. You will inspect the igniter plug for worn threads, eroded, bent, or worn ground shaft. You will check the electrode for height and erosion, which is a very defined amount that's found in illustrations of the maintenance manual. You will then inspect the ceramic to make sure there's no chips or cracks, as well as the igniter lead tip that goes inside the igniter plug. Using a 28 volt power supply, we're now going to check the spark ignition of the igniter plug. We will then hook up the igniter plug to a test bench igniter lead as well as an igniter box suited for the APU model. Once that's connected, you want to clear to make sure nothing is around the tip of the igniter plug. And we will now turn on the 28 volts DC to verify we have consistent ignition. Now that we've verified we have a nice spark and it's a consistent spark, this igniter plug, once finished the visual inspection, is good to return back to service. Okay, we will now move on to the fuel overboard drain fitting. As stated earlier, you may have the standard post-mod orifice fitting that many combustors will have these days, or you may have the older pre-mod fuel overboard check valve fitting. Inspections for both are still found in section 49, 30, 24 in different paragraphs. The orifice fitting, you'll verify cleanliness, you will verify there's no obstructions in the center orifice opening, that the flare is clean, and that the threads are in good shape. If your inspection is found to be acceptable, this will be continued for service. For the check valve, you'll apply air pressure, and you will verify whether the valve is opening and closing at the proper PSIs. If acceptable, you will inspect the threads and the flare, just like you did the orifice fitting. Okay, we will now check the operation of the fuel flow check valve. It's an old pre-mod type, requires air pressure to verify when it opens and at what pressure it closes. The air should only flow in one direction through this check valve, and that would be from where it hooks up to the combustor cap and flows out to the direction to go overboard. So we will apply air pressure as air properly flows through this. Okay, once we have our air line hooked up, we will then now, you'll immediately feel air flowing through the valve, and the valve should shut closed between 9 and 16 psi. 5, 10, 20, 21 psi is when that valve closed. Therefore, it did not check out to be within accordance of the inspection criteria to return this back to service. If it did, we would then decrease pressure, and the valve should open back up at approximately 5 psi. And it barely made that criteria. Nonetheless, because it failed to close between 9 and 16, this valve is considered rejected. At that point, we would recommend replacing this check valve with the newer orifice type. Please know that there are 2 of these check valves on the APU. One at the combustor, as you see here. There's also one at the bottom of the turbine plenum. They recommend per the service bulletin to replace both. If you're replacing one with a check valve to an orifice fitting, you replace both to an orifice fitting. Now that we're finished with the inspection of each part of our combustor, the liner, the cap, the clamp, igniter plug, fuel drain fitting, and the atomizer, we are now ready for reassembly. I do want to bring to your attention that the mounting holes in the combustor cap are quite large, as you'll notice. They're approximately 1/4 inch in diameter. Where the receiving threads in the liner that those bolts go through are only 1032, they're very small screws. In the maintenance manual, it will recommend, prior to tightening up these 3 bolts with the atomizer installed, they ask that you shift the combustor cap over far enough to allow the largest gap as possible between the heat shield of the cap and the liner. Then tighten up the 3 bolts. However, in doing so, you're actually pushing the igniter plug further away from the fuel atomizer process. That situation could cause delayed starts or no starts of your APU. If that occurs, I recommend you loosen the 3 screws. You don't need to remove them, just loosen them. Shift your cap more centered to push the igniter plug closer to the fuel source, and then tighten up your 3 bolts. So let's proceed with assembly. Your first thing you want to do is align the igniter plug boss with the grommet in the liner. That provides positioning to make sure that this is mounted in the proper location. You will then replace the gasket with a new for your igniter plug. You will apply C5 to the threads. You will install the igniter plug until it's just seated by hand, making sure the gasket is fully engaged and not on the top of the step of the igniter plug. We are now going to install the fuel orifice fitting with a new packing. You will apply a slight amount of C5 to the threads of the orifice fitting. You will now thread that in until fully seated. You will not be tightening these items by a wrench at this time, not yet. You will then install a gasket. We recommend you install a service bolt and 7286 gasket under the atomizer. There is a blue color and then there's a black graphite type. This black graphite type, the post 7286 service bolt and gasket, is a much more resilient gasket, less prone to cracks and breakaway. You will then install the gasket on top of the cap. You will position the fuel atomizer in location. The fuel atomizer fitting should point towards the direction of the fuel inlet line that we had removed when we took the combustor assembly out of the APU. You will then apply C5 to the 3 1032 bolts. You will then run these down loosely until they're fully seated. And as stated earlier, prior to tightening these 3 bolts, the maintenance manual recommends you slide this combustor cap over until there's the largest gap possible. But again, if your APU doesn't start or has a delayed start, it may be advantageous to loosen these 3 bolts and put this igniter plug a little closer inward. Once you have it in position, you will snug it down with your ratchet and socket, the 3 bolts. And then, in accordance with the maintenance manual torque values, you will then proceed in torquing those 3 bolts. You will then tighten up your fuel drain fitting, as well as the igniter plug. Torque values for both of these items will be found in the maintenance manual. Once that's complete, you will then continue with a 3-way safety wire of your fuel atomizer. And at that point, your combustor assembly is fully inspected and ready to reinstall back in the APU. So after the combustor assembly is reassembled with all the freshly inspected components, we will then, prior to reinstalling it back up inside the turbine plenum opening, the combustor opening, the maintenance manual, section 492004, which is where you will inspect the combustor assembly, tells you to look up in this opening first prior to reinstallation. It's a visual inspection. They want you to look up in there. If you see no damage, then proceed with reinstallation of the combustor assembly. If you do see damage up in this opening, then we then need to continue with further investigation up deeper into the engine itself to verify how far that damage goes. If the damage is to a certain point, you may have to perform a hot section inspection. So now we're going to go ahead and proceed with reinstallation of the combustor assembly. So what you will do is, again, your fuel atomizer is pointing forward. You're going to slip this up into the opening. It's a nice snug fit. You will then reinstall the clamp. We then proceed to tighten up the clamp Once you get the nut close to being tight, you stop, just get it a little snug. And per section 492004 of the maintenance manual, it will proceed to tell you at what torque value to torque this nut to. When you torque this kind of a clamp, you want to hit your torque value using a rubber mallet. You want to tap the clamp to seat it. You want to tap it around and work your way around to the T-bolt. You will keep proceeding to torque the bolt until it repeats torque. That way we can ensure that the combustor is fully seated and the clamp is fully seated as well. Once that's finished, we can then reattach the fuel inlet line to the fuel atomizer. We can then also attach the fuel drain overboard line to the fuel drain fitting. And then reinstall the igniter plug lead to the igniter plug. You will then be properly re-torquing these items in accordance with the maintenance manual torque values. That would be the igniter lead, the fuel drain overboard, as well as the fuel atomizer B nut. Once that's complete, you will then proceed with safetying the clamp, safetying the igniter plug lead, and that will be the end of your inspection. Thank you for watching.